Hey all. So we've now started the first war in season with bans active. And I've seen quite a bit of discussion about this, but not a whole lot of consensus. And I'd like to talk about where I think that disagreement comes from. I think one of the biggest things is that all the various thought on bans kind of boils down to one of three theories on who the best champions are to ban. And who you decide on is going to depend on your tier, your experience, and which one of those theories you find most persuasive. I'm going to avoid outright saying who my alliance is banning or if I think that maybe we should be banning somebody else. But I am going to talk about each of those three theories and the champions that I think fall under them, and hopefully if you're still looking for clarity on this, then that will give you something to anchor your thoughts and your discussion on to help you find the best choices for your particular alliance. So, the first theory is also the simplest, and that is just ban the champions that are most powerful, that are most common, that people bring in and take the most fights with. There's clear logic here. If everybody is bringing in, five, spoiler on this one, five torches per war in your tier, then if you take away all of the torches, then they're going to have to find what they think at least are suboptimal counters for a lot of fights. Similarly, if you get rid of like Doom, then if he was taking a lot of fights, now people have to find other counters. The weakness of this particular theory is that those counters may exist. They may not, and people finding those counters may not always make the right calls, may not be comfortable in those fights, and you can very well get deaths out of those. So I'm definitely not saying that this theory is not a good one. But the weakness is if people do find counters and then become comfortable with them, you may lose some effectiveness in these. The second overarching theory is I'm going to ban champions that aren't really replaceable. This is where you get to things like people trying to ban Ghost specifically because there are not a lot of champions that counter all of the things she does at the same time. She doesn't need to block. She can shrug damaging debuffs. She can't be evaded. Being able to do all three of those at the same time does have some real impact on certain paths and nodes. Another one for this is getting rid of somebody like House of X. Not very many people actually use House of X to fight, which I personally think is a mistake, but regardless, he is primarily brought in for his pre-fights, but his pre-fights are a completely unique effect. If he is banned, you cannot recover that. Now, the weakness of this particular theory is that maybe you'll be fine without those effects if you have access to the rest of your roster. A ban used on his pre-fights is a ban not used on champions that are probably going to be taking fights. Because you only get 2 or 3, you have to think carefully about that kind of stuff. But a strength of this theory is that it's going to be difficult for alliances to fully adapt around it if they are having trouble with it. There is no other champion that you can bring in and suddenly make stuns passive. So this one may have more staying power. It's really hard to tell. And then the last theory is I'm going to ban champions that I think are having a warping effect on defense. And the poster child for this is Corvus. Back in the day, maybe another example would have been somebody like Blade. People used to avoid placing mystics and villains as much as they possibly could, because in so many places on the map, if you placed a mystic or a villain, then Blade and Ghost Rider and Spark, as the Trinity, would just bulldoze them. If that was where the map was right now, then banning Blade would suddenly allow you to place those villains, those mystics that you were otherwise having trouble with. And that would let you do things with your defense that you just otherwise couldn't, and possibly arrive at a setup that people have a hard time dealing with without that champion. In some ways, this is a variant of the irreplaceable one, but it deals with very specific champions that just completely change how we think about defensive placement. So we've already talked about Ghost a little bit. She kind of goes back and forth between the first two. She is both a very common, very effective attacker and somewhat difficult to replace. But the sum total of her may still be replaceable because there are more evade counters these days, and I think we're going to see quite a bit of Kingpin as a replacement for her for all those hazard shift nodes. Hercules is one that falls, I think, very much on the side of common attacker and dominant, because there are an awful lot of fights on the map where if you just bring in an adequately boosted Hercules, you can probably kill the opponent before they kill you. I haven't seen a ton of this one yet, but it makes a certain amount of sense, especially if you are facing an alliance with multiple rank 4 Hercules in the hands of people who know how to use him. That's a big weapon to take off the table, and some utility they may have to find other answers for. Now, Corvus, I already mentioned, falls more in the blade side of things, where he just warps defenses. Often, alliances will avoid putting mutants, Avengers, tech champions, or auto-blocker evade champions either entirely if they don't think that they're good enough, but especially on the first half of the map to avoid feeding him charges. And that means that you have some matchups that could potentially be dangerous that you just don't place because you don't want to risk somebody boosting to the moon and back with Corvus, getting through it, and now suddenly having a bunch of charges, and then blitzing one of your most difficult paths in Tier 2. So if you take out Corvus, maybe you can set up a more intricate, difficult defense. Maybe not. Maybe you either don't have the champions for that, or when you try and set up that defense, you go, oh, there are other champions that can answer it. But that's the theory behind a Corvus ban. Doom falls very much under the first theory for bans. He just shows up all over the place. Funnily enough, on my war planning spreadsheet that I've shared before, where I list out the champions that different people have, when we get to Doom, I actually write who doesn't have a rank 3 or higher Doom, because it is easier that way. Everyone has him ranked, it's somewhat difficult to die with him, and he is very, very good. He handles buff control, he handles power control. You take out Doom, you take out a big weapon. Now, the weakness of taking out Doom is that I don't necessarily think he's irreplaceable, especially not anymore. There are other shock immune champions, there are other armor break immune champions, there are other champions with good power control and buff control. But, like I said earlier, maybe people aren't used to playing those characters as much, and maybe you can get some kills by forcing them to move off of Doom. Torch also fits that mold. I have seen alliances that have brought 5 or more torches in a single battle group and used them for multiple fights. If you're facing the right opponent, it's really hard to match his DPS. And he gets around certain things with his pre-fight, both with just extra damage, with power stings that punish opponents for throwing specials, and by bypassing shrug abilities. He's a very strong champion. Now, I think that the science class actually has quite a few answers to the mystics that he's most famously used for, so there are some alternatives to him. But combining that with the shrug thing, I definitely see the logic of a torch ban. This is one where I think, regardless of how good an idea it is, I think that it may become less common with time as more and more people discover the rest of the science class. I won't say nobody's going to ban Quake, but I do think very few Tier 1 alliances are going to ban Quake, because you just see her less and less these days. She's only available as a 5-star. The game engine is not at its best right now, and it is just really, really easy to die quickly with her. I think that this is one that you will see in lower tiers because there are a fair number of smaller alliances who don't have many 6-star rank 3s and are managing to punch significantly above their weight class when you look at their rosters by being skilled with Quake. Take that out of their hands, and even if she is replaceable, they may not be able to replace her because they don't have the roster depth. So I can see some logic to Quake bans, but I think this is one that you will not see so much at the top. Spider-Man 2099, I think, fits most into the irreplaceable theory, not because he is irreplaceable. There are actually quite a few alternatives to many of his fights, but because his impact on the boss node is irreplaceable. There is nobody else who takes 75% less damage from all sources when fighting the boss. And so I think that if you ban Spider-Man 2099, you are basically saying we don't expect our opponents to die very much overall, but we do expect them to potentially die to the boss at least once because we did this. Whether that works out, we'll see. But if you are at a level of war where people don't die very much and getting a single kill on the boss could be the difference maker, maybe this is worth it for you. I personally don't expect many bans out of the skill class in general, but if we see one, I think it's likely to be Kingpin, and I think that would probably be because somebody is doubling down on the irreplaceable theory, and Kingpin would be banned alongside Ghost. To basically say, alright, well, there are now 6 hazard shift nodes on the map. We're going to take out the 2 most common counters to them. Good luck. There are some other counters, but you probably have made life a little more difficult for your opponents now. But then you are using 2 of your bans on effectively 6 nodes. So there's going to be trade-offs there. Apocalypse is an odd one because he himself is a good attacker, but I think a lot of alliances do tend to rely on him more as an enabler, because via the Horseman pre-fight he can supercharge an Archangel, or via his synergies he can turn Cable from a dud into a nuke. Additionally, he is at the moment the only champion in the game who can become immune to Disorient, and there are now several Disorient nodes on the battlefield. I personally have not seen this yet, probably because people are assuming, well, if you take out Apocalypse, people are still going to use Archangel. Cable isn't that important, and people will just do something else with the champion that you didn't ban because you banned Apocalypse. But I can see some value here, especially because he himself does benefit from the current war tactic. And then we already talked about this one. Magneto House of X is a good attacker who does benefit from the current war tactic, but taking him out, you are aiming squarely at his pre-fight and assuming my opponents are not going to know how to deal with certain fights without access to this piece of utility. If you're banning Archangel directly, I think you're doing it on the theory that banning Apocalypse doesn't take enough away from him, and you just think that there are placements on the map that are worthless because your opponent has Archangel but would be dangerous if they didn't. And so you're betting, alright, he's available as a 6-star, enough people have him right now, I need to get rid of that. He is pretty dominant, and there aren't many other people who have the complete shut-off while having really high DPS that he does. So I can definitely see this under either Theory 1 or 2, but a lot of people are already placing defenders specifically to try and combat Archangel in the first place. So how impactful this will be in certain tiers, I think remains to be seen. And then finally, we have Magneto. This one kind of falls more into the Quake category of things, where he is incredibly dominant and I think difficult to replace only at certain tiers. For smaller rosters where this is the champion that you tend to rely on for healing control, for auto block control, for miss control, for ability accuracy reduction, for most metal champions, and maybe you haven't run into many Nimrods or other characters that actually counter him yet, then losing Magneto might really make your offensive life more difficult because you just cannot replace him. But I have been seeing less and less Magneto assigned in high tier war lately, so I think the further up you go, the easier it is to replace him and the worse this particular ban gets. And that kind of leads me into my broad point here, which is just that bans in general are going to be a difficult thing to have a true right answer on, because an awful lot of it is going to depend on the defenders you are placing, where you are putting them to maximize the impact of the bans, and the opponents you're facing. Different alliances are just going to be flexible to different degrees. There are going to be alliances against which the irreplaceable theory is absolutely devastating because they do really rely on those particular strategies and they can't really replace them, and now they're going to die a lot because turns out bad matchups are hard. But then maybe you're facing another alliance where, yeah, they use a lot of these really dominant attackers, but they actually have options ranked that they've been itching to use, and they're good at them because half of them play them in other content. Who knows? That kind of thing is hard to predict ahead of time. And so I think we will see at least a decent period where people are trying different things with bans and seeing what sticks. I hope it doesn't settle into a permanent meta, because if it does, then it's just going to kind of be like, all right, well, in Tier 1, these champions don't exist in the game. In Tier 4, these champions don't exist in the game. And that wouldn't really feel like an improvement to me. But if we have enough to work with here to try and keep throwing each other, keep making each other adapt, and use champions and appreciate champions that we didn't before, then I think bans will be a positive experience. I'm at the moment cautiously optimistic, and we'll just have to see how the season goes. So let me know in the comments, how do you feel about bans? How was your first war with them? What did you notice in the off-season with them? Let me know. Happy to have that discussion. And until next time, thanks for watching, and take care.